Hello, and welcome back into my cozy studio, and welcome to episode 3 of my Life in Landscape series. Today, I'm going to be painting an artwork based on the prompt Beachside, which is one of people's favourite kinds of landscapes to paint, I would say. And it may be very typical Australian of me to say this, but I really do love the beach, and I miss it so much living in Canberra. I mean, it's not impossible, but it's a little bit harder to get to the coast from Canberra. So, that all being said, I really enjoyed painting today's artwork. As you can tell, it's getting a bit cooler here, so got all my cozy attire on and ready to take you through this artwork. Now, before we get into the painting, I wanted to share that with today's artwork, I've taken a much simpler approach. I often talk about how using layers in watercolour paintings helps build depth, and I still firmly believe that, and I've still used layers in this artwork, but much fewer than I perhaps normally would, because I wanted to show you how much impact you can still get through using minimal amounts of layers and colours on the page. So, have I got you interested? Let's jump into this artwork. Now, for this artwork, I decided that I wanted nice, crisp white border around my painting, and to achieve that, I'm using some masking tape. So I start by taping the bottom and the top. I'm just doing it the width of the masking tape, make life easier for me, and then once that's ready, I do the same with the sides. Not only does using masking tape help keep my paper in place and give me a beautiful crisp white border around my painting once it's all done and peeled off, but using masking tape and taping it down to my table also minimizes how much buckling once I start adding water to the page. So, finally ready to paint. What I start off by doing is mixing up the color for my sky. The sky in the reference photo is quite a light and dusky blue. You can see that I'm mixing several blues up and testing it on my spare sheet of paper. And I've decided it needs a little bit more lightness, keeping in mind that the more water you add to your paint, the more translucent and lighter it will be as well. What I'm doing here in mixing my colours is making sure that the tone of the blue is as I want it. Once I've got the colour of my blue ready and how I like it, I grab a bigger brush and I start applying it straight to the page. As you can see, I'm sketching out where the horizon line is and starting to place the blue pigment around where I can envisage the clouds being. This is a little bit of reverse painting and can be a little bit counterintuitive. Just have a play around, leave some blank spaces where you want the clouds to be. Once I've started laying down the pigment, I'm using mostly water and not a lot of pigment just to blur out the edges. It's quite a windswept day in the reference photo. I don't want any harsh borders. The clouds are quite wispy, they don't have any definition. And I'm just going through a process of adding more pigment in, blurring out the edges. I continue repeating this process until I'm happy, basically. I keep adding more pigment in, blurring out the edges. You'll notice that as the paint starts to dry on the page, it'll dry a bit lighter as well, and I'll go back in, add a little bit more pigment to those areas to build up some of the depth and layer. The great thing about working with watercolors is they generally dry pretty quickly, so you don't have to wait too long as you are layering it up. Now, as I'm building up the layers of this sky, I am making sure that I'm leaving no part of the paper free of water. I really want it to be very soft, and you need to remember that even though we're painting clouds, they're not pure white, especially in this reference photo. They're very blended out. There are no harsh edges. I'm using my brush very wet, free of pigment, and blurring out any harsh edges I see. I can see here that it's a little bit more pigment than what I want. I want it to be whiter like a cloud. And so what I'm doing is using a clean brush with a little bit of water, wetting the page, and then using my dry cloth to help lift the pigment back up off the paper. It's called the lifting off technique. You can use a spare cloth. This is, I think, a rag from an old t-shirt. You can use a bit of paper towel. Anything like that that can help absorb a bit of the water will help you in the lifting off technique. And I just go across the page doing that in different spots. Doesn't need to be perfect to the reference photo. Have a bit of a play around with it. Feel the flow of the page and the paper and where you think clouds would be, remembering that the widest point of the cloud is the thickest part and that it softens out in the edges. You can see me going back in with a little bit of pigment in the dark areas of the sky where I want it to be really concentrated of colour. And again, using my cloth and a wet brush to help soften any edges that start to form. Once you've got the sky to a point you're happy with it, leave it. Let's move on to the water. Now, in mixing up the colour for the ocean, as you can see, I actually started with green because the sea itself is not a pure blue. It's actually got some green tones to it. So have a play around. What you're looking for is a deeper colour that's got just a tinge of green in it. Now, just as we did with the sky, I'm starting with the most pigmented part of the ocean first and laying down my paint there. I then transfer to a bigger brush that's mostly water, only a little bit of paint. And what I'm going to do is apply that to the page and use mostly water to pull the pigment across to that negative space. This allows the dark area to stay as is. It pulls the same color across the page, but has the light area where you want it, which in this reference photo is toward the right side of your page. I then apply a little bit more pigment in the dark areas and building it up, remembering that it's going to dry slightly lighter, but I don't want to be adding too much pigment to the page. The next step is blurring out the other edge of that harsh line that we've created when we first laid down our pigment. That's because this is where all the waves are crashing. It's slightly lighter, there's not a lot of the blue there, it's mostly the white foam you see when you've got churned up waves coming into the beach. So as you can see, I'm using my lifting off technique again to ensure that those lighter areas stay light. I'm also using it to create almost the waves that are crashing the light areas that you'll find on the beach. And again, just playing around with adding more paint and dabbing it off. I really want there to be minimal colour where the waves meet the sand, which you'll be able to see a greater impact when it comes time to painting in the sand. You need to trust the process with artwork sometimes, and this is one of them. Now at this point, I'm starting to add a little bit of detail into the ocean, and I'm doing that by using a smaller detailed watercolour brush and adding a squiggly line, let's call it what it is, a squiggly line in the middle of that light area that we've painted. This gives the effect of multiple waves coming in and crashing on the shore, which gives you a more realistic look. Waves are not uniform. They are not one straight line, one straight curve. So feel free to be really free with your movements. But what you're trying to do is have the very darkest area of the ocean, a little bit of a lighter so it looks like a wave, another bit of more darker pigment, and then white again. Have a play around with those kind of banks of waves and see what comes through. Now, as the paint is drying, I can see that some of the areas where I wanted it to be darker have dried a little bit lighter. So all I'm doing is going back in using short sweeping motions to add a little bit more color and pigment back in and keeping it as fluid as possible without having to re-wet the whole area. At this point, we're nearly done with the ocean. It is all about playing around with where you want things to be darker, adding in smaller details, remembering that if you make a mistake, you can try lifting it off or work with it, or just remember to be kind to yourself, please, because happy mistakes happen and can actually really enhance an artwork, and you can learn something from it as well. It's at this point that I've decided, okay, I'm happy, I'm not going to fiddle anymore, let's move on to the sand. To mix the colour for the sand, I'm starting with a soft yellow-brown colour. Again, remembering that the more water that you add to your paint, the more translucent and lighter it will be. So again, we are just looking for the tone of the colour. Now, when you're painting the sand at the beach, always start by the shoreline. This is where it's going to be darkest because that's where the sand has been wet from the waves crashing in. This also, like I pointed out earlier, helps you define where those waves end in the beach. I'm playing around with a few different yellows here, all very warm toned, and starting to pull out the pigment very similarly to how we did when we started off with the ocean, getting a clean brush. In this instance, I'm using a little bit of white paint. Don't be afraid to use white paint, it can be really useful and will help us as we are trying to capture the lighter yellow tones where the sand is its driest. Now, we're not going to paint the full sand at this point because it's going to be darker where it meets the trees and the brush. So what I want to do first is sketch in where that brush is. And as you can see, I am mixing up my greens here using a combination of different yellow-based greens, darkening up with some deeper blues, as well as a little bit of black. I then come in and start to sketch out the deepest, darkest areas of the greenery. And I'm starting to pick out where the horizon line sits, because again, that is also made up of a very deep dark green. You don't need to be too concerned at this point whether your colors are perfect or not, especially using this reference photo. There are a lot of very dark areas. Try and get it as close as possible. What we're really aiming for is trying to get the tone of green right. It is a yellow-based green that is slightly grayed out and neutralized by adding in that little bit of black. You don't need to worry about being too pigmented and concentrate in the places that they're going to be the darkest. We're going to build that up with a few different layers. You'll notice that I went through that color green very quickly. And so this is why I really recommend having a spare piece of paper beside you as you're painting to be able to test colors, especially if you run out of a color that you're using and you need more of it. Play around with it. I very rarely use the colors of the paints that in their purest form. I love to mix it up. And I feel like this gives a lot more reality to the piece as well, because the green of a tree is not the exact same shade of green for every single leaf that there is on it. There's going to be variations. Now, as you can see, I've got a very deep, dark pigmented color now, and I'm really starting to pick out the darkest parts of the bush and placing those on the page. I don't need to be too concerned about how my brush strokes look. You'll see how this all comes together really magically later. I'm also using this dark color to pull out the horizon line slightly. Later on, we're going to add in a tiny little hill or mountain at the very end as per our reference photo. Now, where the bush meets the sand, there is a bit of a gradient of color. We start with our darkest color. We then use a slightly lighter green, pulling that out a bit in short brush strokes, and then using the next layer as a layer of slightly green toned yellow so that it all blends in nicely, but it looks as though the sand is slightly darker in those areas. You want it to be a soft transition between the tones and shades. As you can see, I'm picking up some of that darkest yellow that we used for the shoreline, and I'm also adding that in on top of where the sand meets the bush. And once again, so that there are no harsh lines of paint, I then grab a small clean brush with a little bit of water on it, and I blur out the edges of the paint that I've just added to the page, mixing it with the shoreline. And that is pretty much done for the sand. We're not going to play around too much. We're going to leave this as soft and blended as possible. The next step for us is to really start adding some depth back in to our bushland. Now, as you can see, I've got my darkest color again, and I am building it up. I'm using short, choppy brush strokes, squiggly patterns, however you like it. I don't want to fill the page entirely. I want there to be gaps of that undercolor coming through. I'm using one of my smallest pointed paintbrushes for this part. I'm taking my time. I'm using varying shades of green by adding in a bit of grey and a bit of black to the paint that I'm working with to again build up some layers, build up depth and variety in the green that you're seeing on the page. I'm conscious of where the darkest areas are and where the lightest areas are. And I'm really focusing on trying to build up those darker areas, because what you'll see me do later is actually use a wash of colour to blur out the brush strokes. And this is how I create so much more depth when I'm painting greens in bushland, in trees, in bushes, you name it. This is the technique I use every single time. Once I'm happy with the depth and where the lights and the darks are sitting, this is where I bring in my little magic wash. So mixing together a lighter shade of green, I'm using a brush with a lot more water on it, and I am liberally applying that across the section. And as you can see, it is blending out my brush strokes. It's getting rid of a lot of that detail, and it's softening up the edges between the different shades of green. And you can see how much more smooth and blended it looks. To add back in a little bit of detail, I use the lifting off technique once again, using a clean, slightly wet brush and my dry cloth to pull pigment back up off the page from the areas that I want to be a bit lighter, because as we blended in with our little magic wash, we lost those areas of lightness a little bit. While that dries, before I put in the final details, I'm going to focus my attention back onto the horizon line, adding in that little hill that we talked about earlier. There's some mountains on the horizon line. They're very similar shade of green to what we used for the bushland. You can play around if you want it to be a slightly bit more blue. To me, it looked very similar, muted dark green color that we were using for the bushland. And I'm just kind of eyeballing it, sketching in where the mountains are. Doesn't need to be perfectly the same as our reference photo. I'm leaving a little bit of a gap between the bottom of the mountains and the edge of our bushland, because as you can see in the reference photo, there is a small little town there. It mostly appears white. We're not going to worry about the details too much, but we're going to leave a little bit of space to kind of signify where the town is going to be. So I'm blending down the color of the mountains, adding up a little bit more depth to those, and as you can see, leaving just a slither of white between the top of our bushland and the bottom of the mountains. And I'll show you later how we pull in all the little details. For now, I'm going back over the bushland with a bit of darker paint to again add back in a little bit more detail for where the darkest parts of the bush are. I'm also adding darker details back into the horizon line where the mountains are, And this is where I'll use some short, choppy little brush strokes around that white space to make it look like there are little buildings in the distance. Just a few little brush strokes so it looks as though there is a little bit more going on than what meets the eye. I'm using a clean, wet paintbrush to pull a little bit of pigment back up off the page, not too much around the mountains, but just to ensure that there is a little bit of depth there that is not all the one tone and shade of green. And with that, the mountains and the bushland are pretty much done, and we are nearly at the end of this artwork. The very final step is to add in that brush in the foreground. And to do that, we're going to mix up a darker shade of brown. To mix this colour, I'm starting with a base of brown, adding a bit of blue to it because the colour of these bushes is almost a bit purpley. I test the colour on my spare piece of paper, and once I'm happy, I start applying that colour to the page. Now, to create these bushes, I'm starting with the very heads, and I'm just dabbing my paintbrush on the page, clustering my paint strokes to create like a bushy head, and playing around with the placement of these bushes. There is no exact science here. I'm just eyeballing it. What you want to have is a big cluster that eases out towards the edge, as per the reference photo. I add in a bit of dark because again we want to have just a little bit more depth and detail to these little bushes. So where the darkest areas, which are kind of clustered in the center of each of these heads of the bushes, we're going to add that darker pigment in. And then once the bushes are pretty much how I want them to, I'm going to use that darker color again to just create some small lines for the branches and the twigs that hold up the heads of these bushes. Again, there is no exact science. Use some short, sweeping little brush strokes to create your twigs. Remembering that for the bigger clusters of paint, they're going to have more twigs because that's how plants are made, and just having fun. Just play around with their placement. And once you're happy, we are done with today's painting. The only step that is left is the very satisfying task of removing the masking tape. You can do this when the painting is still wet, when it's dry. Have no fear. It is not like working with an acrylic where it'll budge. If your painting is very wet, you may want to wait a little bit. But this is the exciting point when you get to reveal your artwork. For me, sometimes it's a little bit distracting working with my blue masking tape because of the color of it. And lifting off that blue is such a satisfying feeling, revealing that crisp white edge underneath. Now, if in pulling up your masking tape, a little bit of the paper comes up, as happens to me a couple of times, as you can see here, all you need to do is use a very clean paintbrush with clean water. Do not use that blue water that we've been using for the whole painting, and just apply it to the page where a bit of your paper is lifted. Just a little bit, doesn't need to be soaked. It'll just help blend it out, and you won't even be able to tell that a little bit of the paper lifted off. And that's it. I hope you enjoyed today's tutorial. If you're participating in the challenge and you followed along, please don't forget to tag me, and I will see you next time.